and kick us off. So welcome everybody. My name is Laura Wills. I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Relations. I want to mention that I am recording this webinar for some folks who can't join us at this time, but will be watching later. So thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Race in Transatlantic Conversation, Comparative Look at Race in Europe. And this is one of our Global Experiences webinars. So if everybody could please mute yourself for now, there will be some time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Joining me today, we have Julia Carmine from our Toulouse program in France and Nidra Sandiford, class of 2010, from our program in Malaga, Spain. So with that, I'll turn it over to them.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laura. Can everyone see the screen okay? Yes? You should be able to, sometimes there's a green box and then it disappears and you're left wondering, are they seeing what I'm seeing? But yes, we're all together here and we're all sharing the screen. So first and foremost, welcome. Thank you all for being here. Please feel free to put your name and where you're listening in from or participating in from or where you are from in the chat, whichever one you prefer. As Laura mentioned, I'm Nidra. I am based in Malaga, Spain. I'm the administrative director here. And Julia.
Bonjour, bonsoir, hello. I'm coming to you from Toulouse, France. I'm the director here of the Dickinson in France program. And I also want to, it wasn't something we reviewed in advance, but I'd like my colleague here also, who is a Dickinson alum, to introduce herself as well. There she is, listening from Toulouse, France. And Laura didn't put her year in, but she's also a Dickinson alum. And I wanted to say, very pleased, some of you heard me in my ramble before we started, very pleased to be a part of this conversation today, to garner so much interest from people coming from different years, different perspectives on this topic. So it's a real pleasure to be with you all today.
Laura, sorry about that. Laura is going to briefly say something, no worries. So yes, and so we're also joined by two esteemed guests, Zion and Nelly, who are a current student and also a Dickinson alum, and they're going to be just sharing as part of their experience. Just very briefly, so we'll be talking about, again, just the questions that we put up under the description that are going to guide this conversation, right? The construction of race in each context, in my context, we mean in Europe and the US, foundational historical events and discourses. And then this is where our two wonderful esteemed guests who have agreed to participate with us are going to come in later on and let us know about their experiences around race in Europe and in the US. We will also leave time towards the end for a Q&A, so we would like for this to be an active conversation. If you have maybe questions that you want to address later on in the chat or just comments or things that stood out to you, feel free to put them into the chat and we will get to them and address them as we turn over to the part of the presentation where we do our Q&A. Lastly, thank you so much for being here. It is really an honor to be doing this work around diversity, equity, inclusion, around race, around inequality, around intercultural communication, right? All of that is wrapped up in this work, and we are really, truly grateful that you are all here to do this work, and it's also an honor to do it among the Dickinson community. I think, as we all know, we come from a really great place to have these critical conversations and analyze these situations. And again, just thank you all so much. With that, I'm just going to check the chat really quickly. Nashville, Wayne, PA, Baltimore. Right, so good. Pretty interesting group for a bunch of different places. So just to jump right in, I'm going to start here just talking briefly about the construction of race and what we mean by that and how we are framing this information, the conversation that we're having here, and just our general framework around how we're thinking about race and during this presentation. So the first thing that we want to point out, again, is race as a socially generated category, right? There are no biological markers that say this and that. It is just the way that society places us into different boxes and categorizes us. It is easy to see, but difficult to discuss, right? So it's a socially constructed category, and for the purposes of this conversation. if we take it as a socially generated category, then we have to think about categorization as a tool of domination, right? And of course, we're thinking about other categories that have certain power, right? They give the holder of these categories, or the people who are in these categories, they put them in a certain position, right? And so I think you may have heard the term positionality, right? And thinking about how people's identities are perceived, where they are in the world based on their identities. Well, part of that is the categorization, right? And the way that people are placed in certain categories and then therefore are assigned power, right? Which gets us to the next point. The categorization is also a tool in the construction of wealth and power, right? So when we talk about inequality, whether it is in the US, whether it is in Europe, whether it is around race, whether it is around gender, whether it is around socioeconomic class or religion, all categories, we are thinking about the ways that wealth and power are constructed, who has that wealth and power, and what positions, right? What position people are found in based on those categorizations. So when we think about race in the US and Europe, and I want to be clear here, we recognize that Europe is a continent made up of very many different countries, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're thinking about Europe as specifically and mostly the European Union, right? As a governing body that has laws and objectives that each country then expands upon or interprets in its own certain way. So that's what we mean when we say Europe, just to kind of put that out there. So we're thinking mostly of our experiences, right, for us in Spain and France and Italy, thinking about our programs abroad and our students, right, and the places that they go in England and Italy. So when we say Europe, that's the sort of Europe that we're talking about. And so when we think about, again, that category of power, that social construct, and the way that it has changed, we're really thinking about the ways that we can bridge intercultural communications and diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because the category of race is going to be experienced in different ways based on culture, right? So intercultural communications isn't necessarily just language integration and immersion and learning about the food and learning about the dress, religion, history. It's also about understanding the layers of inequality as it relates to a certain culture for where you are, right? And so marrying the ideas of ICC and DEI, you get the shift in the categorization of race due to culture, right? And this image, which is actually taken by Julia during the BLM protest last year in 2020, you'll see that it's not just people saying BLM for George Floyd or Amir rights, right? You have victims of police brutality or people who have died under mysterious circumstances in France that probably have to do with who they are and their race, right? And how they're categorized. So it's not necessarily just BLM in the American standpoint of how people experience race in the US, but there's a shift, right? And there's a different cultural paradigm to acknowledge when you're thinking about race in Europe versus race in the United States. There are political and social processes around race, nationality, and class, which I think is, in my own personal experience and, generally some of the biggest differences when you think about the constructions of race in the US and Europe, right? In Europe, the idea of the nation state and everyone is a citizen and this colorblind ideal of all of us and everyone together, right? Because we all share the same nationality, whereas in the US, it's not necessarily the same. We have actual laws, right, that talk about race and that specify race. We don't, we count that on our census count. We ask people to specify, race, gender, religion, right, ethnic origin, right, things that we don't do in Europe for various reasons. And then there's also something to be said about the fluidity and synthetic nature of racial identity, especially when you see the differences between how these things are experienced in the US and how they're experienced in Europe, which, again, our esteemed guests who we are so happy to have here are going to talk about. And you'll see that it's fluid, right? It's a category that is fluid. It's a category that changes. It's a category that changes over time, right? Demographically, it changes. And I'll get into that a little bit later on. This is a wonderful graphic that I found, and I think that it really and truly, gets to some of what I was talking about before, right? In terms of nationality, in terms of class, in terms of racism, right? So we have this liberté, égalité, fraternité. Sorry for the pronunciation, Julia, but I tried. And so in the middle of that, you have blah, 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 right? Because again, you have this idea of this color blindness, this, let's not think about our colonial past. Everyone who comes here is a citizen and we don't see color. Everyone is, free and equal and brotherhood, right? If you are a citizen, then you are to enjoy all of the rights of being a citizen of a certain country in Europe. So you do have access to the healthcare and you do have access to education and you should have access to housing, but we all know that worldwide housing is becoming a scarcity for most. But in theory, right, regardless of your color, you do enjoy that in Europe. However, we know that there are structural inequalities in Europe and they are around race. They're not codified specifically by race, but they exist. There are issues in access. In general, there's only about 0.5% of political members across Europe are people of ethnic minorities, right? 0.5. We're still having firsts. In Spain, we just had in the last 5 years our first MP of color, right? The place where there are the most sort of, members of parliament from ethnic minorities is in the UK, but there are many places across Europe where it's still not the case, or you're having a first within the last 5 years. There's also the othering of ethnic minorities that exists in Europe, right? And for that we have Mesut Özil. If you follow football, right, this is a quote that he made a couple of years ago. So he's German when they win, but he's an immigrant when they lose, right? Mesut Özil is a third generation German. So not his dad, his grandfather, right, was someone who immigrated to Germany from Turkey. So by all intents and purposes, he's completely German, right? And again, it doesn't matter if he was first or second generation, but he is German, right? And it's important to point that out. However, as we've seen across Europe on other national teams, the Italian national team, the French national team, which some people colloquially call the African national football team, right? Because it is made up of very many immigrants who hold French citizenship and who are, French or German when they win, but immigrants when they lose. This also speaks to an important shift in demographics worldwide, not just in Europe, but thinking specifically about Europe, whereas you are seeing now the first people who are born, or the adults, right, like the young activists who were born of immigrant families who are becoming much more visible. You have a lot more, people who are mixed in the US, right? The projections are showing that there will be more people of color, right, in the US. So again, demographics are changing. And those demographics, again, are indicative of that fluid nature of race and how it changes over time. It changes over time, it changes over demographics, right? It's a category, right? And we can't ever forget that category and how it changes and how it shifts. In the US, we have structural inequalities crafted specifically around race. In 1952, in certain communities in Seattle, a Jewish person could not own a home. It was placed specifically in, what we call these restrictive covenants that were before the Fair Housing Act of 1968 that officially outlawed housing discrimination. But what does that mean? That means that we actually had laws and have laws, and these restrictive covenants still exist in many deeds on many properties in many cities in the US that strictly prohibit the sale of homes to people based on race, right? No Blacks, no Jews. At a certain time in America, it was no Italians, no Irish. All right, so again, just an indication of that category and how it changes. Race in the US is highly publicized and exported, right? And so what I mean by exported is, so we have BLM and we've seen how that has had an influence around the world, but we also export things like the Cosby Show, right? And the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and these shows whereby people think, or, around the world, oh, well, that's cool. This dude was in West Philadelphia and he was born and raised and now he's rich and everything is great, right? And if you don't know that reference, it's from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But a lot of times, and especially in Europe, that is how people of color or ethnic minorities sort of find their footing around identity, because it's not a conversation that's had in Europe, right? Where we have these like all Black shows or all Muslim shows, or we have our Fresh Off the Boats, right? Which is a show with people from Asian descent, right? We don't necessarily have that too much in Europe, or we haven't historically. Now we do. We have production companies like Netflix and other production companies worldwide that are making local content based on those local populations, but we didn't have that. And so for a long time, the US exported race relations, right? We're also, everything that happens to us is highly publicized, right? So I think everyone, George Floyd has become a household name in a way that Adama has not. Benjamin, I believe, Michael Jackson dedicated his 2001 album Invincible to a young man of Norwegian and Ghanaian descent who was killed by Nazis. His name is Benjamin. That's not a household name for us in the US, but we export, right? We export the good and the bad around race, right? And again, we export the way that that category is seen. Race in the US is highly complexion-based and monolithic, right? So if we see you, we see difference, and we will react upon that difference. There was a case of a Jamaican, a Canadian, and an English person, all of African descent, who had the police called on them in California as they were checking out of an Airbnb. I don't know if people kind of remember that case. I think it happened a couple of years ago. Right? No one asked if the people involved in the case, where they were from or what color, what passport they had. It's a difference from Europe because, and even in my own personal experience, I will see, right? You do see Black. This is it. It's easy to see, right? But once my American passport becomes part of the equation, the formula has completely changed. The formula has completely changed in a way that is not the same in the US. It's not the same in the US, right? It's complexion-based and highly monolithic. With that, I'm going to take a step back and pass it over to my colleague, Julia. And Julia is going to just place us with some historical discourses, right, around race through times that kind of informs this conversation and gets us to a place where we understand why. Why is this? Why are things the way that they are currently around this category of race?
Thank you so much. Gracias, Nidra. Wonderful entrance into what is, and we hope you see that, really quite a complicated conversation. And so we're hoping that as you listen, you're also really letting those questions bubble up and generating sort of the ways that you may want to join in, because we'll have a chance to do that with you in a Q&A at the end. So putting on my teacherly hat here, I'm a trained sociologist, and having worked in study abroad for over 20 years now, I began working in China. Mainland China was the first time that I really knew that I wasn't from there, that my visible difference became a very big part, just as Nidra said, of my daily life and perception of what people saw of my visible face. And then when I could open my mouth and speak some Mandarin Chinese, there was yet another confusion and layer. So many of you may have some stories like that bring you into a conversation that, again, may have to do with personal anecdotes that open your eyes, that allow you to understand nuances and features. But one of the reasons that Nidra and I really wanted to, and we really thank Laura Willis and Alumni Relations for bringing attention to this conversation, is that it's not just an intellectual exercise or a personal development story. This is really a conversation about race that we know comes at a time and a place whereby, and here's my point about context and specific historical context, we are living in a moment when we know that it is very important and pertinent to discuss how race is lived, how it's used as a discriminatory tool, that these are functions that aren't just an interest in sociological vocabulary, but they are played out on the streets. And so all of, Nidra's references to BLM and even now the vote in Minneapolis that just took place around defunding the police after George Floyd, that happened a week ago and we didn't pass. So where are we now? We do want you to know that, part of our interest in bringing this topic to light is not just for a history lesson, it's to draw some lines and to help us bring a lot more consideration and nuance to the conversation. And a lot of you have studied abroad and or traveled or are interested in that international comparative model. And that's why we hope that that can bring, again, a light of increased intercultural skill base, but that can also really inform the conversation around what is diversity today in the United States, what is equity, and how do we really understand that inclusivity when, and let's refer to the map for a second on your screen, when we know that it's impossible to discuss the foundation of America without talking about the slave trade. Nidra pointed out that race, as is understood in American context, is about an exportation of an idea. It's also about a commodity. I'm thinking about the Hollywood complex and Will Smith, who actually just wrote a great book recently too, that's actually really does touch on some of these topics as well, that construction of that type of what a hero is in that particular model. Of course, African slaves were not heroes. They were seen in a categorization whereby race was used to create commodities. And if you look at this list, this is from a wonderful map project at the University of Richmond, whereby they are talking about this trade in human objects relative to material objects, right? That's what the slave trade began upon. It used an ideology thereby of basically an early capitalist mercantile way of forming human relationships around what was not only a transatlantic slave trade, but an intra, if you pay attention to what's happening on the African map, an intra-African slave trade, which is to say, we cannot talk about slavery just only in terms of race. We would do better to talk about a lot of the structural pieces that have to do with an ideology around creating objects based on a typology of race, but used for a capitalist profiteering system. So let's look at the American side just for a second for that helpful nuance. The arrival in North America is, of course, North, Central, and South America. And in all of these places today, and let's not forget, we also do have a Brazilian colleague that's working in study abroad in Dickinson as well. And conversations with Giselda around race are going to show us that there's a very different picture of who is considered colored, who is considered white on that side of the ocean as well. It has a lot to do with this specific kind of history. And let's move on to the next slide, Nidra, to talk not only thereby around, next slide, because I can't move it. We can talk now about a variable of not just commodification of people as objects, but now the people themselves in their visible differences. Once upon a time in immigrant story in the US, Italians arrived not via a slave trade system, but to participate into, which was an economic system that was very much capitalistic. And by virtue of economic integration, Italian immigrants made their way into, this is a story reported by the New York Times, they made their way into whiteness. Italians, when they first arrived, and this was the case also for Irish, and this also had to do with categorizations around religious minorities, being Roman Catholic. There was not a conferred status of the dominant group until the Italians sort of proved themselves. And they proved themselves not only by gaining economic foothold, but by maintaining intra-group relationships whereby they could more seamlessly integrate and fit in. Now, is that the story of the American melting pot? Because what we did recognize, if we're talking about race still, is notice that the Blackness became more white as people became more invested into particularly a local economic system that, of course, they also helped build. And let's look at the next slide. Another way to think about historical origins, talking about race, not only now on the US side, but on a much more global picture, is an important point in the shift, not now from the slave trade, but from the idea of the empire. And here you see emanating out from that teeny tiny island, which is the British Islands, all those big red splotches that made their place in the world through colonial imperial domination. So as we know, that led in many different places to stories of any number of mixed race populations emerging. And as time went on, so again, looking at the variable of historical context moving forward, that empire will die, and it will die World War I, World War II in particular. It will die when another small island called Japan is going to really upshow the imperial powers of Britain through militaristic prowess. And that the whole model of imperial British rule will in many cases become upended by a US model, and we referred to it before, which was much more about sort of self-starting capitalism. And how interesting that, as we saw in the previous slide, that story of race could almost also be upended, like the empire was itself, by a greater participation in the capitalist economy, and that liberal democratic US story that in many ways also became a foundation of what happened in the European Union post-World War II, really informs the story that we're talking about today. So hopefully that was not too long about the historical economic origins of race, and I'll let Nidra take it from here, as well as some of our student participants.
Sorry, I think I'm getting a little bit of lag. There we go. And so bringing it back to today and thinking about, and Julia's last slide especially makes me think about the quote when we think about Europe, and again, talking about those national identities and the colonization, it makes me think about the quote, "We are here because you were there," right? And so there's that idea of how people from the former colonies, get to these countries in Europe and again are afforded this citizenship but do suffer certain inequalities based on who they are, right? Based on their ethnic minority status. And so we have this idea of shared identities in different cultures, right? I'm talking mostly about, again, the Black Lives Matter movement and the way that it has become worldwide. But in a large part, it has become a little bit more worldwide because we've spent the last year and a half at home due to the pandemic, right? We spent the last year and a half really and truly tuned in to what is going on around the world, not just around Black Lives Matter, but around the COVID pandemic, which in and of itself has also exposed deeply rooted inequalities all over the world for people who belong to a lesser category, right? The people who have the forward-facing jobs, the bus driver, the people who live in the slums that help global cities operate, right? Because when you have a big global city like a New York or a London or a Paris, then you also need to have the suburban areas that are filled with people who belong to certain racial categories to sustain that sort of capitalistic movement of labor, right, and flow. So it's thinking about the ways that we've seen Black Lives Matter kind of be exported, the COVID pandemic, and how it has helped us see that. I wanted to move to experiences, individual experiences. And again, this is where we're going to bring in our two students, Nelly and Zion, to let us know what their experience around race has been, like as they've seen in their experiences in Europe and in the US. So feel free, I guess, Nelly, we will begin with you to just introduce yourselves and give us your, your feedback, your idea, your experiences. So, we understand.
Hi, thank you. Could you hear me? Can you hear me well? Okay, yeah. So first, to introduce myself, my name is Nelly Tita. I'm originally from Kigali, Rwanda. I moved to the US when I was 8 years old, but just for work, so I'm not American. I'm currently a senior at Dickinson and studying business and political science, and I'm currently in Toulouse studying abroad. I've been here for the past 2.5 months, almost 3. I feel like I've had a couple of identities growing up. I've had a lot of chances to be in different parts of the world and experience different cultures and people's assumptions of where I come from and who I am. So starting with the US, I've lived there for a long time. I'm usually seen as I'm seen as a Black woman when I assimilated to the American culture. So for example, once I completely lost my accent, I started speaking like American person because I was young. People didn't really realize I wasn't American. And so when I say I'm not American, they're always like, wow, but your English is so good. And so things like that are like experiences that I still get from the American experience. So it's not as easy to tell that I'm not American, but at least in the US, race is spoken about. I was talking to one of my friends the other day, and we were just talking about how in the US you can kind of see what people think of you, especially when they're negative. Like you can tell that through conversations and just by looking at people. There's times when you can tell that, but it is difficult. It's different when it's harder to hide all of that. I mean, it's easier to hide all of that when you don't have those conversations and when those conversations are scarce. So yeah, it's very different in other parts of the world that I've been in. And also in the US, this is just something small that I've realized when I see someone on the street who is also Black, a Black woman, someone who's just looks like me, there's usually an exchange of a look, a smile or something. And it's just to see, like to show that you're here, like we see you, you're seen. So being in France for the past couple of months, I've seen how that drastically changes how my identity has drastically changed from how it is in the US. So I very much agree with I've seen this colorblind approach on the topic of race in France, and it's something that they seem to be very proud of, and because the French identity is the goal, and for this identity to be the goal, to be reached, it can be restrictive. So for me, it looks like you have to erase a lot of different people's identities in order to meet that one goal. So living in the US for so long, that's not something I'm used to because everybody has different identities. Everybody comes from different places, but here it's very much don't talk about race. It's not something, that's not the first thing that we want to know about you. So it's very different adjusting to that. There's not many conversations about surrounding race here, and which is sad because I've faced a lot of like microaggressions, small microaggressions coming from Africa, and also microaggressions because I'm Black. So some examples, a lot of very much uncomfortable questions about my hair, whether we have this things in Rwanda, and it's very much genuine questions, but it's things that would be known if more conversations were being had in like homes and like as Nija was talking about, like the TV shows that I grew up watching in the US, a lot of the questions that I'm asked here, I'm like, oh, that's something like somebody wouldn't ask me in the US because like it's all over television, it's all over like everywhere. So just an example of a very uncomfortable experience, but I want to shed light on like things that just happen every day. So I was having a conversation with somebody who was French, a man who was French. He asked me how I get my hair like this. So I had braids, they were very long. He asked me if it's heavy, and I'm like, oh no, I'm used to it. And sometime at the end of the night, he came up to me with like scissors, like as a joke. And he was like, oh, let me cut it for you so it's not heavy anymore. And he was laughing, clearly like it felt like a joke. And I was very uncomfortable with this. And it's very different to like translate that uncomfortableness in a whole different language. And also it just seemed like a very normal question because he had just learned about how I got my hair done. He had just learned about what extensions are for braids, and so many steps had just happened in that one night. Like at the end of the night, it was still like, wow, that wasn't enough. There's still so much that we have to do. And it's just daily conversations that need to be had and daily things that you have to notice. And I feel like I got those questions when I was growing up in the US, but after a while, they went away. And so I just felt like I was stepping back a little by little because I had just assumed a lot of people already knew certain things and didn't have a lot of those questions anymore. But even this, it's not uncomfortable to answer all those questions, but there are times where you're like, oh, I didn't realize that was so different that I have to reteach again another person. But one thing I've definitely seen differently is how in here, I'm usually with Americans from Dickinson. So everybody we usually meet considers us as the Americans, since we're the only Americans that they've come in contact with, usually with like other students who are also doing study abroad. So I've never really took this American identity serious because I am from Rwanda and I'm never really mistaken for being American a lot of places. I'm just someone who lives in America. So I know the American identity has huge advantages. It has many advantages. As Nidra was saying, the American passport is extremely, like, you have so many things that you can do with that. And so most times I don't know how to take it because there are so many advantages that my American classmates have, and opportunities for resources that I don't have the same. And it's just difficult sometimes because I'm like, I have to explain that I'm not from there. I study there, but I still don't have the American passport, everything. It's a lot of different things. But one thing that I've come to appreciate is that whenever I say I'm from Rwanda, there's at least people know where that is. In the US, usually 8 times out of 10, people don't know where Rwanda is. And it's just here in the US. I mean, in France, I've just seen how, like, I'm always so shocked somebody knows where Rwanda is. And a small thing that I've told Nidra and Madame Carline and Reynaud was that when we were introducing ourselves one time from a student who was studying abroad here too, he's from a different country, we were introducing ourselves and I said, hi, he said, hi, my name is this, and I'm from Belgium. And I said, oh, hi, my name is Nelly, I'm from Rwanda. And he goes, oh, I'm sorry. Which, if you didn't know, Belgium colonized Rwanda in the past. And so he was basically apologizing for his country's colonization of Rwanda and how, like, all the horrible stuff that they've done. And we were able to, like, talk about so many things that happened, like, in the past couple of years, where, like, Belgians were manifesting because of, like, all this colonial past that they don't talk about. So I really appreciated, like, the moment to, like, actually talk about that, because we don't talk about race and all these colonial pasts in normal conversations. So that's a little bit of my experience here so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nelly. We're going to hear from Zion.
Okay, guys, you can hear me all well? All right, so first of all, yes, my name is Zion Ahmed. I graduated from Dickinson in the spring of 2019. In terms of my background, my identity, I think it's similar to Nelly, kind of like complex. So I was born in India, in Kolkata, but my family were from Bangladesh, which, if you know a little bit about India and that subcontinent politics, there's plenty of arguments between Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. And then I moved to the US in 2004. And I mean, I was born a US citizen. So in terms of, like, my identity, I've always been an American in that sense. And moving to the US, I never had this massive shift for myself, because in Bangladesh, I went to a US school. I was with international classmates. So it was actually kind of the opposite when I first came to the US, where I thought, it's not diverse at all here. You know, I thought the US would be so diverse, but in my school, I had all these different nations represented. And so as I grew up, you know, you get a different perspective. Now, in terms of my experience in Europe, I am currently in Madrid. I studied in 2017, 2018 for the academic year in Malaga. I mean, I fell in love with my experience in Spain. And so after graduating, I decided to come back. I think a big difference, as Nelly was talking about, between being in Europe and being in the US, is that, like, that idea of the conversation that exists, and then the conversation it's not a problem here. You know, we don't have a problem with race in Europe. Sometimes it's the ostrich with the head in the sand. Where in the US we have conversations, people are talking about it. So a frequent question sometimes I get from like my friends here are just like, you guys really obsess about race. And I said, I don't think it's that we obsess about it, but when we compare the conversations in both regions, you could view one as obsessed versus the other. Um, Now, in terms of my personal experience in Europe, I think one big thing that I'd have to stress is definitely the people I surround myself with. And because unlike Nelly, like except for my beginning in like my study abroad, I was just for my personal, I think I had a little lag there. Okay. Well, my main thing when I came for study abroad and really kind of expanded on that in my time teaching in the south of Spain and now doing my master's was to just assimilate with non-Americans. I kind of wanted to get away from the Americans. And so a big thing that I've seen now in my year in well in my time in Spain is obviously with many immigrants from Bangladesh and India, who we're especially the Bengalis. It's sometimes I feel like you are my countrymen, but we come from very different backgrounds. I've grown up in the U.S. I'm here studying a master's, whereas these are people who've come looking for a better life. They're working hard, and so the way sometimes people see me on the street, they don't see me as a brown Bengali. They'll see me as some mix of a person because he's with a group filled with Venezuelans, Mexicans, Spanish people, and he's speaking fluent Spanish. So we don't know where he's from. And so I think for me, a big thing about navigating race, both in the US as well as in Europe, is that I've got a very loud personality. And so I feel like I end up like by the time I speak and you meet me, I've bridged that gap where race was never that first topic in mind because I didn't give you time to think about that. So I personally haven't had too many, I guess, like race-based experiences up until this past weekend, which it was my birthday last Wednesday, and so on Saturday I went out with my friends to celebrate, and we made a reservation at this club. And long story short, one of my friends came much later, and I was telling the doorman that, hey, these are the last people in my party who are coming. He said, "You're Zion, right?" I said, "Yes, like the one and only." I said, "No, 20 people walked in before. There's no way that these people can come in." And I knew that was a lie because I only had 7 friends inside. Now, the person could have given me the reason that it's way past your reservation time, so that's the reason that your friends can't come in. But his like his reasoning was, with your name, I know many people have walked in, so you're lying about people using your about this is just it was my word versus his. There's no point going through that battle. But that was a moment of like you could have used such a better logical argument of this was your time, you didn't come, that's why I won't let you in. But his initial argument was completely different and using the "you're different." With a name like Juan, maybe there's 5 other Juans on the reservation, so which one? But there's only one Zion. um on the other side, like the positive and like the differences, I think especially we were talking about the complexity of like what race is, and in the US, especially based on complexion versus in Europe. In Spain, it's very interesting, the whole culture between like northern Spanish people and people of like Castilian descent versus in the south in Andalusia. And then within all of that, you have like the Gitanos, the gypsies, who like the Romani gypsies, and that these different, I guess, like social hierarchies and how those are developed. And I remember in my time in the south of Spain, in Jerez de la Frontera, over there, which was an interesting like matrix and mixing, would be, many like immigrants from North Africa settling there and over time creating families, and the families especially mixed with other like gypsy families, and these unions of kind of both the others combining, which is I found very interesting, which we don't talk about or understand that concept in America in the context of Europe. It's all Europe, but understanding that within Europe there's also these hierarchies, the way someone from Scandinavia might be viewing the Spaniards as they're the joke of Europe, they have a horrible economy, they're lazy, right? And so these intricacies in terms of the concept of race and diversity within Europe is very different from the context of what America is. And like my personal reflection was always thinking about the US in a sense is, as we talk about like a country of immigrants, and I guess like our biggest identity is a doctrine, this constitution, whereas all these European countries in a sense, and even in Asia and all over the world, but these countries have had histories going back before, like going to prehistory. And so they've kind of developed this idea of like, this is what, let's say, Andalusia is, this is what Castilla is, that in America, unless you're an indigenous, I think technically we could all just say we all come from immigrants in a sense. So I felt those two, I guess, differences in the framework, it was crucial for me kind of understanding like everything that I experience here, I kind of put it in this is what I experience here, and I can't necessarily relate that always to what I experience somewhere else. I kind of treat them all as individual experiences, and then it's the reflection that I'm able to kind of put them together and see how I felt.
Zayan, thank you very much, Nelly, both of you. These are wonderful illustrations and personalized stories of, again, it's a good year to be a sociologist. I really feel like you are, going about what is, and I'm here to say that I think we're actually talking about science. I think we're actually talking about a very complex set of, as you were just saying, Zayan, ways to reflect on any number of anecdotes about getting into a club or wearing your hair differently, and trying to understand that's on a daily level, but bigger forces. Zayan, you were pointing to historical realities. Nelly, you were talking about a colonial past. How do these things actually continue to play out in how we construe relationships with each other? And again, how we talk about that conversation also is part of a cultural discourse. Are we obsessed with it? Are we, today looking at it because we are in the US, these rootless people that are, trying to amend this idea of lack of affiliation. We can't trace ancestorship necessarily very well, some more than others. And isn't it interesting that there's a trend right now in seeking out sort of online genealogy as kind of a pastime? So we're at a very interesting place to have this conversation. And in so doing, I know people came and showed up to this conversation with some interest. I thought I'd start out the Q&A and asking our group here today, are there new things you heard today, things that you want to share from your own experience that touched on either your own personal story or things you want to sort of take away as a reflection? And now's the time for that little empty space to see who wants to talk first. But we all believe you have great things to offer. Whether you want to speak or not, you can also add something in the chat. So to be clear, you could just unmute yourself and speak, but. We know over the last year that we're supposed to wait for like 20 seconds to let, this sink in, to let somebody get the courage together to come forward. I'll start with the question that I put in the chat, and it has to do with this idea around history. Do you remember Nelly's point? She met a Belgian student and his first instinct was to apologize to her. Why do you think, and that's of course Francophone country, it's not France. Why do you think people in France know where Rwanda is? Right? She was saying in the US, people are like, what? Where's Rwanda? I'm sure Nelly knows. Zayan?
Just I guess like my best educated guess would be if at current due to historical relations, if at current there are, like, I know for example in Spain, like people from Latin American countries can get citizenship here and many of them end up immigrating here. So I wasn't sure if maybe due to the same reason that's why the French might be able to know.
So there's no, like, France is not doing that, right? They're
Okay.
not saying like, let's open, but your example is a really good one, which is to say historical, colonial, imperialist relationships in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular in Central Africa, are going to point exactly to France's relationship with Rwanda, with surrounding countries, with the fact that, Nelly heard French growing up. It wasn't necessarily the language spoke at home, but it was not entirely foreign to her, right? And that also is from Belgium's presence as well. So whether it was a first instance of specific colonial powers, also too, when we think of in the early 90s and the big conflicts in Rwanda, and particularly France, its government, has played a major role. And today it's still current in politics to think about, and again, that interest in the dialogue around history. Mistakes were made. There are apologies around France's role in Rwanda or not, ignorance of, and which is to say a choice not to look into or to get involved militarily in an internal conflict there. So there are ways in which young people in a classroom are going to know. They're going to be able to point that out in a map. And another reason would be a much more simple one, la francophonie. They spoke French there once. Right. And it's that idea of an identity that is linguistic, but is absolutely fictitious, really, in my view, today, even though the largest French-speaking populations today are located in not necessarily neighboring, but nearby countries in sub-Saharan Africa. This is where, France needs to be understood in terms of its role on international politics and as a world language. So again, those interesting intersections of understanding that difference. It's not just about the hair or how Nelly walks or if she has an accent anymore. It's also getting into the intricacies of trying to understand where that difference comes from. And hopefully, one of the takeaways we can think about today is these testimonials, hopefully our way of decentering the conversation, not only about the past year of what's gone on in the United States, but to, get this group really to think with a curious mind about why these conversations are happening the way they are. So Lee, thanks so much for your hand. Let's hear from you.
Hi, sorry I came late to the discussion. I find it very interesting. I guess I had a kind of tying the two things together just now about kind of recognizing our past, or some countries or regions recognizing their past, to something that Nelly was speaking to. And maybe it's a clarification. Nelly, were you saying that in America we don't talk about race as much as they do in Europe? In Europe, it's more of an open topic of conversation, or did I have that backwards?
I was talking about how in the US there's more of a conversation around race than in Europe. It's more of a colorblind approach where we don't see race, basically. So there's just one identity.
Mm-hmm. Do you view that as a positive thing or a negative thing?
Growing up in the US, I view that as a very negative thing because there's a lot of things politically that turn, like, especially in France, like there's a lot of politics that's around that colorblind approach, and it affects certain people's ability to express themselves, like their racial background or anything, or their religion even, like things like that are seen as something that you should not talk about. Therefore, yeah, so it affects certain people's people's ability to like work in certain industries and stuff, because there's laws against you working in there because of something around your race. So, yeah.
Okay. I just find it interesting because I think as much as race kind of comes up here and in certain ways, that we don't talk about it enough still in this country. I think we still have a lot of reckoning to do, in my opinion. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification, Lee. It's really important to get those things right, which is to say the directionality of in which context it's where. So I appreciate that you bringing that forward. Others may not have gotten in the same way. And thanks to your encouragements to continuing these kind of conversations, because I think you're right, Lee, that there's any number of input points, there are any number, and I wanted to say that too, even regionally where this group is coming from in different places, it's not the same. So that's where I think we can say that there's a endless amount of ways to approach it. And Kelly is probably going to have a next one. Thanks for your hand, Kelly.
Hello, excuse me, my voice is a little raspy today. I had a question kind of related to the last one in terms of, given this nation state mentality or goal that France and other European countries have, what have you seen in terms of, and this is open to anyone who's has spoken, what have you seen in terms of the reaction or the acceptance or basically their reactions to movements like Black Lives Matter, Stop Hate, and other similar movements, specifically in these types of nation state mentality countries?
I think that that's a wonderful question, and I think that I'm very, very interested in the reactions, right, and the pushback that you will have on the ground. And I think part of the reason is for what we mentioned before, in terms of this marrying of intercultural communications and diversity, equity, and inclusion. In that, a lot of people see this as an American conversation. A lot of people see this as America is we are imperialistic even in our activism, right? So we are pushing this onto people whereby they don't, they don't see the need for it because it is a US conversation, right? And so there are certain things that, I do think that that is a very valid point, because we can't let ourselves here in Europe necessarily have the US discourse be part of the conversation, but we need to make our own conversations around inequality because it does exist here, right? And there's an excellent New York Times article about this in France, because that was one of like the biggest things where it was like, the Americans are on our campuses and they are polluting our way of life and our scholarship, and we can't let that happen. And I do think that's a valid point. People do want to protect their own culture, but what we can't do is, just let it fall to the wayside by calling it American when we have inequality here in Europe so much. But there is a lot of pushback and there's a lot of resistance. I think that would happen. A lot of that resistance is anti-American in and of itself, right? Not necessarily like people have this colorblindness and this nostalgia for the colonial times, whereby they don't want to think about inequality because they don't want to think about their part that they've played in that. But it's a question of kind of making their own discourses culturally around what inequality looks like in their locale. But there is pushback, I would say.
I think we might have time for you, Scott. We'd love to hear from you. Please.
Just one quick question. From the students' point of view, students coming to your programs for a year or a semester, can you just sort of say, like, how do they deal with racial conversations or lack of racial conversations, or what attitudes do you typically see? Are they surprised, or are they focused on only learning the wealthy culture of Europe and not necessarily the challenges of the immigrant culture and so forth?
At least from my experience, when I went for my study abroad and I did the year-long program, I would, in terms of my reflection of it, I remember, I'd say majority of it, and what I would argue most people who I've seen have done programs to study abroad in Europe, it's kind of been like a Euro trip, an opportunity to come to Europe and see your greatest hits of all the places and have fun. And I was able to kind of take advantage of the year in a very different way, where I let myself enjoy and be like the typical American tourist my first semester. And then my second semester was a lot more just getting to know what is Malaga, like what do the young kids here feel like, and like talking to my students and hearing about, the idea of like the job search in this economy, and that, the pressure that puts on the younger generation here. I think definitely for longer, I think for the short stays, sometimes from my experience and from my classmates, and there's nothing wrong with it, but I think it's usually been like I want to have as much fun as I can while also learning. And that was my personal reflection. Although I'm sure that, I mean, of my friends that I know that have gone to programs in Latin America and South America, and I believe, I forget where it was, maybe in Cameroon. I can't remember exactly, but I remember those friends would talk about experiences. Definitely, I mean, I think just way more holistic in terms of like the impact it has on one's view on the world, and the problems that one place can have, and the way the past is affecting the present. But that's my personal opinion.
Thank you.
Just to add on really quick, I feel like so far I think the topic of race and everything has, and like the topic of like issues that people here face has been like a slap in the face, as I would say, because I feel like yeah, it's something that I can't really avoid because of how I look like, or but even like the people I talk to, like it's just something that has to come up because also we live in the US and those conversations come up. So it's very normal for me to have had those conversations and like had been surprised by the lack of the conversations. And then also we do also do volunteering, and I've been able to talk to like people who are immigrants who are having a hard time with like everything, who've had a hard time in like Europe and everything like that, through like immigration system and stuff like that. So I feel like I've had it's been like in front of my face to see a lot of these issues that are brought up.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks so much for that conversation, for that topic comment, Scott, and for your input, Nelly, Zayan. I know our hour is passed, and Laura, so I don't know if you wanted to say any closing words. I know that some of you have already left or need to leave to be on time.
That's fine. Demetra, did you want to do anything with your last slide here with the takeaways?
Right. Well, I'm not going to read the slide to you. Thank you, Laura, because you can do that very much on your own. The dialogue, hopefully, that we're modeling today is one that we hope that you feel free to continue understanding. And there were some great comments in the chat about that too. Of course, US locations involve any number of local considerations. So one thing, and Nidra and I talked about this as we were formulating this presentation, my background in sociology has always taught me this, that math is hard, physics is hard, and social science is somehow supposed to be easy. It's not, because there are a lot of phenomena that we can define here today and talk about dimensions of diversity in terms of categories, social roles, in terms of hierarchies, positions of power, oppression. We can talk about historical formations of boundaries and how they further exacerbate inequalities, commodification of human work. Like the list could go on. Those are phenomena that happen globally. How do they apply in the context where you are today? We're hoping that some of the takeaways could be to use that sensitivity to the broader ways of that conversation to see your way through what can be, and I really thank you, Nelly and Zayan, what can be painful and tiring and frustrating conversations while you're abroad also, which is to say you're living on the inside of that difference and how others may or may not be understanding it. So empathy is with you, definitely. And of course, the clear, I want to say, collaboration of that conversation is one whereby we can reach out in much more curious, comprehensive, understanding ways by trying to get a hold of some of these phenomenon and not only be overwhelmed by the difficulties that they present in the world today, because we know it's a part of a much larger picture of ongoing phenomena in the world. That's definitely where CGSC stands in terms of the learning experience, which also Zayan has some fun. We do have some fun when we're abroad. That's part of it. It's personal development as well, but we clearly want you, and again, all of you on this call, but also those of you who have your own study abroad experiences, to continue to unpack them really with some of this newer understanding or refreshed understanding about a conversation in race that may or may not just be American. Certainly in my mind, it's one that can encompass a lot of, again, Dickinson sort of values and goals too, about community, about enhancing understanding of difference, about civic engagement, where you are, with whom you are, understanding the differences, the diversities, the equities, inequities that are in your place. That's a big takeaway, but that's what I got. So thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. I do have to step away. I am a commuter and I've got a commuter rail train to catch outside of the city. But again, thank you all, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much, Nelly and Zion, for your contributions. And I hope to see everyone again as we continue this conversation.
Yes, thank you, everybody. I appreciate all your input and your questions, and I hope to see you at a future event soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.